Right. Are you starting us off, Sharon?
I think we've gone.
Go.
We're live. We're live.
All
Hey,
live.
everybody.
Hello. So, are you starting us off, or am I starting us off? Sweet. All
Why
right, I'll
don't
start us off.
you start
All right.
us off? Hi, everybody.
So, yes, hello. I am Dr. Courtney Plant. I'm here coming to you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and I am wearing my mask because I am a good, conscientious citizen of the world.
I am less a good, conscientious citizen of the world, but I am in a studio, and I am by myself, so I am social distancing. Hi, I'm Dr. Sharon Roberts, and I am from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and I'm really excited to be with you.
Perfect. So, welcome everyone to our talk. I think it's about time we get to the furries. The furries who've been waiting for so long. I'm going to take this mask off because I can't present in it. Perfect. All right. So, yeah, furries are coming to you live here with our talk at Eurofurence. Now, when I've given this talk in the past, we took some flack in previous years because we like our puns. We put silly pun titles for our talks, and I thought they were funny. Apparently, puns aren't as funny as I thought. So this year, you don't get any stupid pun titles. You just get clickbait titles. So our talk this year, 50 crazy facts about furries, number 28 will totally blow your mind. And this is definitely not clickbait. So, yeah, this is what we've been reduced to. So thank you to everyone out there who hates my puns. This is what you get.
I love your puns, Nuka.
And at this point, I should also thank the Canadian government for helping to fund much of this research. Thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This is where your tax dollars at work. So
yeah, we're really grateful for the funding of our government.
Yeah. So, okay, the layout of this talk, it legit is laid out as a bunch of sort of fun facts. And rather than just put number one in sort of a boring sort of way, we decided to spice it up a little bit. So we went around to all of our Furscience followers, and we contacted furries out there, and we had them send in pictures, the numbers 1 through 50. And we didn't quite get all 50, but we got most of them. And then we got some duplicates of some other ones. In true furry fashion, it's a completely disorganized mess. But we've got fursuiters who have happily modeled for us the numbers. So we have fun fact, number 1 here, our first starting fact of the talk. Believe it or not, real scientists study furries, and we are among those real scientists. So Sharon, who are our first scientists?
Well, these are our core people. We do have other people that we're partnering with, and we're always excited to collaborate with new people. So if there are other researchers out there who have some ideas for how they want to engage in furry research, we're happy to collaborate with anybody internationally with their ideas and working on it. But having said that, these are some of our core people. We've got Dr. Elizabeth Fine, and she's at Duquesne. She's a clinical psychologist, and she is working on our studies of theory-anthropy, and she's leading up our work on autism. Next, you see Kathy Gerbasi, Dr. Gerbasi. She's Professor Emerita now, and she was at NCCC, and she is a social psychologist. In the bottom here, you see Dr. Stephen Rayson, and Stephen is just a publishing machine. He's a social psychologist out of Texas A&M, and he is just amazing. And that's me in the corner here, shot taken in Las Vegas. And I am a sociologist. I'm one of the token sociologists on the team. And I'm an associate professor at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. And I study identity formation.
And last of the team is me. This is me establishing my furry credentials. So I am Dr. Courtney Plant, a professor of social psychology at Bishop's University in Quebec, Canada. And in addition to being a Fur scientist and one of the co-founders of Furscience and the lead data analyst for it, I'm also a furry. I've been a furry for the better part of 13 or 14 years now. I was a furry before I was a scientist, so kind of the best of both worlds. I got my feet in both of those particular ponds.
Yeah, we really we like this because our team is it is a mix of people who are furries. We tend to collaborate with furries along all of the processes related to research, and then we have a number of people on the team, like myself, who's not a furry. Although I get accused of being a furry all the time, and I'm okay with the accusation, but we'll see.
And here at Furscience, we are legitimate scientists. We do actual science, believe it or not. So this isn't just we talked to a handful of furries that we found in a bar one night, And I decided to draw all these conclusions about the entirety of the fandom based on that. We've been studying the furry fandom for the better part of 10, 11, 12 years now, depending on where you put the starting points. To date, we've actually studied more than 30,000. That number's out of date now. More than 30,000 furries from more than 70 different countries around the world. And we published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, book chapters. The short version is that there's a lot of this data that we've collected, and I've had to painstakingly go through and enter one cell at a time, millions and millions of cells worth of data. And we take all of this data and we make it available through our website, Furscience, which Sharon can tell you about.
Yeah, so we were looking for a dissemination hub for our work. So we realized that most people, a research article will get read maybe 1.7 times, and that I think it includes the editor and the reviewers, which means that most reviewers aren't even looking at it. But what we wanted to do was take what we were publishing through peer-reviewed scholarship and make it palatable for the public. Part of being a funded research project is a responsibility to the public to take what we're doing and to let other people know. And so Furscience became our mechanism for engaging our scholarship with the broader public. So there's lots of things that you can find on our Furscience website, including a lot of data and research results. Now, here's the thing. Before we go any further, you obviously have spoken about being funded a couple of times already, but our dissemination, just related to what I was talking about, is really essential to our financial support from our government. And if we can have a body that we can disseminate to and sort of show that we've done this, it really does help us to continue doing the work that we're trying to do. So if you haven't had a chance yet to follow us on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube and get the notifications, please. If you haven't had a chance to do that, it really is important that we have this kind of reach with our people. So if you can take 3 seconds right now to go on Twitter at Furscience and hit the like button, that would be great. Go to YouTube and hit the subscribe button at Furscience as well. Thank you.
It's also the easiest way to be a part of our studies. Next week, we're actually launching a study. It'll be coming out. We'll be announcing it on Thursday or Friday, looking at COVID in the furry fandom. So if you want to help us figure out how this COVID pandemic is influencing the furry fandom, check us out on there. You can participate in this big international study. It would really help us out.
Yeah, and we are very much bound by our ethics board, and we are waiting on one last crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's. But we have a place marker. We have a place marker on our Furscience website. If you go to the furscience.com website under participate, we have a place called for study number 9, and that's where you'll be able to see our latest study. But of course, we will be advertising through our Twitter and our Facebook and the other mechanisms that we have for reaching our public.
All right. And we're not done. That's not everyone who is working with us. We're actually quite fortunate this year to be working with a couple of other young scholars who've been helping us to better understand the furry fandom. So they're not officially affiliated with Furscience, but they have independently collected data and have very generously sent it to us to help us sort of corroborate some of our findings. So we have Mikhail Dmitryevich Danilov, I hope I got that close to right, who is a sociology master's student at Belarusian State University, who was very kind in helping send along some data from some of the Eastern European, Russian sort of furries out there in languages that we don't speak, so that's been very useful. And we also have Gao, who is fantastic in helping us get a large sample of furries from Southeast Asia. So again, for the first time ever, we've been able to take a lot of our findings and contextualize them against the furries around the world. So what do North American or European furries look like compared to furries from Russia, furries from Southeast Asia? It's been very exciting. So you'll see that data pop up juxtaposed against our own data throughout the talk. So kudos, very, very grateful to these fine folks. But enough jabbering and preamble. Let's get to the data that I know you're all here to see. Let's jump right into it. So fun fact number 2. Furries are fans, at least the way we've conceptualized it in our research. So there's a million different definitions for what a furry is. For the purposes of our research, we define furries as people who are fans, right? They're fans specifically of media that features anthropomorphic animal characters. So Star Wars fans are fans of Star Wars, and Harry Potter fans are fans of Harry Potter. Furries are people who are fans of any media that features walking, talking animal characters doing human stuff. Now, you might be thinking, well, hold on, my grandmother liked that Zootopia movie. Does that mean my grandmother is a furry? That would be awesome, but not necessarily. Because the second part of our definition is you have to like this stuff enough that you apply the label of furry to yourself. So you like it enough that this label is important and meaningful. You use it to convey to others, this is a part of who I am. Right? So you have to like this stuff. It has to be enough of a part of you to define who you are. And really we conceptualize it as an identity, not just an interest. And that's important from a psychological perspective, because if we construe it as an identity, there's a lot of predictions and things that we can make about how being a furry may affect the way you think, feel, and behave. So that's sort of our working definition of what a furry is. Furries are fans. So fun fact number 3, thanks again to our 2 models here for modeling number 3.
Great photo.
So furry media, when we say that furries are fans of furry media, that's way more than just Disney movies, right? So a lot of people say, well, doesn't that just mean you're a fan of Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse? Maybe, but that's not the whole picture, right? So when we ask furries, well, what media got you into being a furry in the first place? You can see that it's actually the internet and sort of independent artwork that was sort of the biggest drivers into leading furries into the furry fandom, which isn't to say there isn't a place for Disney, right? Whether you're sort of a newer furry or sort of classic furry or somewhere in between, Disney has its clutches in all of us, and it's slowly leading us all by the hand into the furry fandom. So I, for one, welcome our Disney overlords and the role that they play in drawing generation after generation of furries into this fine fandom of ours. And it's not just in sort of Western cultures where you see this influence of Disney-esque films. You can see here, this is from our South Asian samples that have been sent to us. And you can see here that in Malaysia, Disney's Robin Hood was a big influence, one of the many influences that got people into furry. You can see that in Taiwan, Zootopia and The Lion King were a big influence. In Thailand, Zootopia and The Lion King. In Japan, they had Balto. And so you can see that sort of, regardless of where you go in the world, these kinds of animated films and video games and comic books play a tremendous role in inspiring that initial spark, that ember that grows into the flame of interest in the furry fandom. However, I would definitely be remiss if I limited the talk of furry media to just Disney, right? It's easy to sit for an outsider to look and say, well, it's just a bunch of Disney stuff. Because if you spend time in the furry fandom, very quickly you realize that there's a lot more here than just a bunch of Disney films, right? We have musicians and comedians and gamers and podcasters and puppeteers and artists and writers, just an incredible variety of talented content creators that all make up this complex quilt, this patchwork of media that we consume in this fandom. And if you're wondering what draws people, why do people like this stuff in particular? It's sort of like asking, why does someone like chocolate? Why does someone like vanilla? It's kind of hard to put your finger on what exactly it is, but we do find that when furries try to answer that question, certain things routinely pop up, right? Again, looking to our Southeast samples here, we can see that cuteness, regardless of whether we're talking about Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand, Japan, cuteness is one of the top 3 reasons why furry media is so liked. It's cute. Right? Appealing characters is another thing that comes up. It's creative, a love of animals. But notice in Japan, sexual appeal is one of the top 3 reasons. We're going to come back to that a little bit later, but you'll notice that that's in Japan and not the other Southeast Asian groups. That recurring pattern is going to be seen where there's something a little bit different about the nature of the Japanese fandom that you don't quite see in some of the other Southeast Asian groups. So just store that little nugget away for now, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So fun fact number 4. This fact is that furries are not the same thing as related fandoms. In this case, we're going to go with bronies. As a brony myself, this is particularly relevant to my interests, given that we are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the last episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. And I think it's very important at this time, as the brony fandom, their main content is kind of coming to an end, to reflect on the similarities and differences between these 2 groups, because there certainly is some overlap between these two groups, whether or not furries and bronies want to admit it. Some of the older furries in the fandom may recognize that maybe you don't see it now, but certainly 7, 8, 9 years ago, there was definitely a bit of a rift in the fandom as to whether or not bronies were welcome in the fandom. Were they this invading force that was going to take over the fandom? And we don't really see that anymore these days, but it was definitely a contentious issue then. What we see is that 10 to 20% of furries these days are bronies. That number is probably down a little bit since the time we collected this data, given that the show has come to an end. And then also, having studied the brony fandom and written a book on bronies, we find that on the flip side, about a quarter of bronies also call themselves furries. So the overlap is certainly there between the two. And again, with the My Little Pony fandom coming to an end, it raises the question of where are they going to go? Where are these bronies going to find a home, a place where people can get along and appreciate those who like media featuring anthropomorphized animals? Geez, I'm not sure if we'll ever figure out that particular question, where they can go. And just a couple of quick fun facts for the any bronies that might be listening. When we asked who's the best character in My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, to no one's great surprise, it was Twilight Sparkle, the best of the ponies, followed closely by Luna, also a pretty good pony. Sorry to all the Rarity fans out there, but your pony, well, pick a better one next time. I've just started a war in the comments. Yeah, and in case anyone is interested in this research, my colleagues and I have written an entire book just on the subject called Meet the Bronies. So if you're interested in the subject, you can go check out the book. It is basically a tome of everything you could ever want to know about the psychology of the brony fandom, put together in one book with a really ugly cover that we had no control over whatsoever. So
yeah, that's definitely not your pick.
Nope, wasn't my first choice for a cover.
You should have heard the text that I got from Nuka when that cover came out.
Yeah, there was a bit of profanity in it. But so fun fact, number 5. Furries get immersed into the stories and the media that they consume if they have furry characters in them, right? So we don't just like furry media, but when you take a story and you put furry characters in them, we get more engrossed in it. It's more engaging for us. So it's no surprise that, yeah, the immersiveness of this content is one of the big draws to it. When we ask furries, hey, to what extent do you get immersed into this media when there's furry characters in it, you can see that there's a bit of an increase. It's not a dramatic increase. It's not that furries can't get immersed into media that doesn't feature furries, but just the small, draw a tail and put some ears on it, and furries are just a little bit more invested in that character as a result of this. More, and this effect is even bigger. The more furry you consider yourself to be, the more central it is to your identity, the longer you've been a furry for, the stronger this effect tends to be. And so the idea is that furries are connected to this furry media in part because it's so significant to them. They get so drawn into it that it has a big impact on the way they think and feel and behave. So fun fact, number 6, this is kind of related to that previous one. Furries are influenced by the media we consume, just like everyone else is. We can't consume media and not be affected by it. It's one of the reasons why we consume media in the first place, is because it has an effect on our feelings or the way we think. There's been a ton of research done on this in the violent media domain, where, hey, watch some violent crap and people become more aggressive. I'm not going to get into an argument. I wrote a book about that as well. What I want to focus on, though, is some of the positive ways that this could help, some of the ways that consuming media with a more positive message, like many of the sorts of furry pieces of media that we consume have these sorts of messages, can affect us. So in this case, we did a study on My Little Pony, right? So again, for those bronies in the audience, My Little Pony is a show that has this positive pro-social message to it of helping and kindness, acceptance. And again, in a lot of furry-themed media, there's these messages of acceptance and kindness. Recently, I watched the anime BNA, which, if you haven't watched it, is absolutely fantastic. And it has these messages of pro-social and helping and acceptance of other people. And so the question is, what happens when you have a group of people who consume this kind of message, or this media with this positive message? So we've actually published this in a scientific journal article with a title, called Letters from Equestria, which I was rather proud of. But even more proud, I'm even more proud of the first paragraph, which is, Dear Princess Celestia, today I learned a great lesson about friendship, which I fought tooth and nail to make sure that was in a scientific journal article. So that was one of my little hashtag career goals. But the gist of this article was that, yeah, for those who consume this media with a pro-social message, they actually tend to show more empathy. Right, Rooster Teeth was our comparison group. We compared it to a group of people who consume internet-based videos, right? And they're a fan of those kinds of groups. And we found that, yeah, those who watched more My Little Pony tended to report being more empathic people. And in turn, those with more empathy tend to engage in more charitable acts, things like donating blood or donating money to charities. And, you know, as anyone who's ever been to a furry convention will tell you, furries kind of support charities. It's kind of a big deal to furries. So I think it's not too surprising to anyone that, yeah, consuming this kind of media and having these sort of pro-social norms does have an effect on our behavior. So whereas I have to watch furry media and My Little Pony for my job, I've just given you a reason to do so, and you can feel good about it. So you're welcome. You're making yourself and the world better by watching this stuff. So.
Hey Nuka,
yeah.
we had a question from I believe it was Fenrer369,
Sure.
who wanted to know if we were doing correlational analysis or regression analysis.
Both. So it depends on the particular study. Not to get too stats and jargony here, but typically if there's more than one predictive variable, we'll usually run a regression analysis using multiple predictors. And if we have multiple outcome variables, I'll typically run a structural equation model just because that's my jam. So
it's good jam.
Fantastic question.
It's good jam. I like that jam.
It also points out, by the way, if you do have questions, feel free to shoot them off in the chat. If it's relevant at that moment, we'll try to get to it. But what will probably happen is we'll cultivate a bunch of these questions, and then at the end, there's time for Q&A, and I will happily let you all talk my ear off with questions. So.
Yeah, we're trying to let a little beaver work in the background, so we're wearing earpieces to try and make this work.
All right, fun fact number 7. Furries have a very active imagination and a healthy sense of fantasy that goes along with it. So, the very fact that we are consuming media that features walking, talking animal characters suggests that, yeah, we're okay with letting our imagination and our fantasy go wild once in a while. Now, when it comes to this kind of content, the question arises, well, okay, do furries consume fantasies that are created by other people or by themselves, right? So do you make up your own stories or do you consume the stories that other people have made? And the answer is a little bit of both, right? By far the biggest response is that furries tends to do a mix of consuming the stories that other people tell, but also spinning their own rabble, their own yarns, and having their own stories come out and be expressed through artwork, through writing. And we've actually published several studies on the subject of fantasy. The one I'm most proud of in particular makes a distinction between what we call positive fantasy and negative fantasy. So positive fantasy is the good kind of fantasy. This is the self-expression and art and being creative and writing stories. This is what people think of when they think of artistry, for example, or self-expression. Negative fantasy is sort of the downside, the shady undertones of fantasy. This is the kind of fantasy that people get worried about. This is the you're losing touch with reality kind of fantasy. The I'm not going to work because I'm playing World of Warcraft for weeks at a time kind of fantasy. And there's a concern that people have as their friends and family get into this furry thing. They fall down the furry rabbit hole. Are they getting in too deep, and are these furries all engaging in way too much of this deviant pathological fantasy? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. When you look at the kinds of fantasy furries engage in, it's positive. Furries are very active in their imagination. They're very creative. But you don't see a significant difference from non-furries with respect to pathological fantasy. Furries aren't losing touch with reality. Furries aren't engaging in the fantasy so much that they can no longer go to work. They can no longer function. So yeah, furries are creative individuals. They have active imaginations, but not to a fault, is what this data seems to suggest. Oh,
Sorry,
And,
I hit the pause button there. Sorry. I always liked the results of this because to me, one of the things that we see as critiques of the fandom is that, they're just, they're pretending and they've lost touch with reality. And we have evidence that really refutes that.
Related to this idea, so if furry is centered around the idea of anthropomorphizing animals, some people have asked us, well, okay, so do furries just anthropomorphize animals, or do they just put faces on everything around them? And that's a good question. And so we asked furries, hey, do you anthropomorphize all of these different things? And what we tend to see is that furries mostly anthropomorphize animal-themed things, animals in particular, but also everything from pets to domestic animals to NPCs in video games, right? Especially animal-themed ones. Plushies and stuffed animals, to some extent, they'll attribute some kind of life force to them. But as you get to more further and further remote from that, furries are a lot less likely to anthropomorphize those things. So it's not that furries are looking around and seeing faces in everything and assuming their computer can talk to them or their fridge can talk to them. It really does seem to be quite limited to the anthropomorphization of animals specifically. And any tendency to anthropomorphize one's car or one's appliances or to yell at your computer as if it can understand you, that's fairly normal too. You see a little bit of that in the general population anyways. So fun fact, number 8, most furries have a fursona, right? So a fursona is this anthropomorphized animal-themed avatar or representation of yourself. We can see Boozy Badger, a rather well-known furry in the fandom. That's Boozy's fursona. That's my own fursona, Nuka, you see there. Furries are remarkably creative when it comes to their fursona, sometimes to a frightening fault, as it were, with horrifying results. But nevertheless, we do find that furries are a remarkably creative bunch of people. For many of them, that very act of coming into the fandom often involves the development of a persona, whether it's an explicit act of creation or just something that emerges in them over time. We tend to find when it comes to personas that about 95% of furries say that they have had at least one fursona at some point in their lives, right? And you can see here that for the most part, the biggest spike there is at one fursona. So when it comes to how many fursonas you currently have, most furries will say one, which is not to say there aren't furries who have 2 or 3 or more fursonas at a given time. That tends to be more the exception than the rule, though, is what we find. And when we do find that furries have had more than one fursona, it tends to be in a slow, gradually changing manner, and you'll see why in a second. But just to look around the world at furries sort of from other parts of the world, and Southeast Asia in particular, the blue part of the circle is the yes, you do have a fursona or a furry self, or however the term translates into other languages. You can see in Malaysia and Taiwan and Thailand, all 3 of those samples, overwhelmingly furries say, yes, I have something that could be called a fursona. So sort of in those parts of the world, you see much the same thing that you see in North America or in European samples. Japan is a bit different in this regard. You see that only 28.2% of Japanese furries will say that they would have what they might call a fursona. And again, you'll notice that Japanese fandom is a little bit different in this regard. It may not be quite what we consider to be the furry fandom there, the kimono, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but their fandom there is quite a bit different than what you find in other parts of the world. One of the reasons why we're so keen on hopefully going to Japan and or studying the Japanese fandom someday in the future. That's
we just need to get through this pandemic and we should be there.
That's the plan, knock on wood.
The plan, yes.
So fun fact number 9. Furries have these personas, and for many furries, they are meaningful, they're deep and meaningful things. So it's fairly rare for a furry to just make up their persona on a whim and say, it doesn't mean anything, I've just sort of made it up today and it doesn't mean anything, right? For a great deal of furries, they put a lot of significance into the crafting of their persona. When you ask furries directly, hey, to what extent is your furry a representation of who you are? And overwhelmingly furries say that, yeah, my persona, if not identical to me, is quite similar to who I am in appearance. As an appearance and personality, I use here as kind of a fun little example. Violent J from the Insane Clown Posse, for those who don't know, Violent J's daughter is a furry, and as a way of supporting his daughter, he had a fursuit made and actually went to a furry convention. And you can see, obviously, his persona is a good representation of his stage persona, right? His character from the Insane Clown Posse. So furries do put a lot of themselves into their personas. We see the same tendency around the world. Again, in Malaysia, in Taiwan, in Thailand, you tend to see that more often than not, furries tend to put a lot of themselves into their personas. Again, Japan being kind of the odd one out in that regard. It's sort of a mixed bag as to whether or not people imbue their personas with who they are.
Can't wait to do it. I can't wait to get to that data.
So fun fact, number 10. Most furries create personas or they sort of form these personas that are better versions of themselves, these idealized versions of who they are. So we've asked furries, hey, does your persona represent who you wish you could be, who other people think you should be, or a worse version of who you are? And the blue bars kind of tell the story there. So the blue bars, you see this big hump around the right side. And that's the ideal. To what extent does your persona represent an idealized version of yourself? And overwhelmingly, furries are on the right side of that scale. Furries say, my persona is like me, but a better version of me. A funnier, better looking, wittier, more clever, more likable, more sociable version of me. Right? It's very rare for furries, when you look at the green bar there, it's very rare for furries to say that my persona is all the worst parts about myself. Again, not unheard of. There absolutely are furries for whom that's the case. But again, that's far more the exception than the rule. And again, this isn't just in Western samples. When you start looking at Southeast Asian samples of furries as well, you see the same tendency towards personas that are idealized versions of yourself. Because if you're going to create a fantasy version of yourself, why not make them a better version of yourself? Why not make them into the image of yourself that you sort of like the most? Fun fact, number 11. When creating these personas, furries often borrow elements of other personas and take it for inspiration for their own personas. And for the most part, furries seem to be okay with this. So when we ask furries straight up, do you think that you shouldn't base your persona species on someone else's persona? Do you think we should avoid doing this? Furries overwhelmingly disagree with that. They said, no, there's no problem with looking at someone else's persona and saying, hey, that's cool. I want to be that species, or I like that color. I would like to use that color for mine. Furries are pretty cool with that for the most part. And when you ask specifically, is it okay to take cool parts of other people's personas and add them to your own? Again, furries overwhelmingly said, yeah, I'm cool with that. Only about a quarter of furries said, no, that's not cool. In fact, many furries express this idea that they'd be flattered if someone wanted to take elements from their own personas and use it for inspiration for their persona. In terms of whether or not you've actually borrowed from other personas in your own, most furries say no. So furries are pretty okay with the practice. Some of them have certainly done so, but a lot of furries say, no, I wouldn't do it, but if you want to do it, that's okay with me. So fun fact number 12. Furries are not Therians. So we've already contrasted furries against bronies. So now we'll take a minute to contrast furries against what are called Therians. So remember, we're sort of defining furries presently, at least in our research, as having an interest in media that features anthropomorphized animal characters. So we're conceptualizing furries as fans. A Therian, on the other hand, is a person who isn't a fan of anthropomorphized animals. They're not even necessarily interested in anthropomorphized animals, but rather a Therian is a person who feels this strong self-identification with a non-human animal, right? So this can be everything from a spiritual connection to feeling something psychological, or in some rare cases, something physical, some kind of tie to a non-human animal despite residing in a human body.
I was going to say on this point, just to give you some idea of how long it can take to engage in this kind of research, we spent about 5 years doing preliminary work to be comfortable saying the following, that furries identify with animals and Therians identify as animals, and working a lot with the Therian community to try and make those research statements.
It's also worth noting that these are not completely non-overlapping circles. For example, we do find that 7% of furries would call themselves Therians. So indeed, there is some overlap between those circles, that Venn diagram. And if you want to see why it's so important to make that conceptual distinction between the two, you can take a question like a question we ask furries typically, which is, do you ever feel not entirely human? Do you feel not 100% human? And what we find is that furries and Therians answer that question in dramatically different ways. If you ask that to a furry sample, about 35% of furries will say, okay, yeah, to some extent, there's some part of me that doesn't feel 100% human. If you ask that same question to a group of Therians, 86% of them say yes. So this is why it's so critical to make sure when you're defining these terms that you have a clear definition that you're working with. Because otherwise, if you treat them all as the same and you lump them all together in the same category, you're lumping together people who might answer very differently on a particular question. So, number 13. No, Therians are not making it up. This is a question that we were often asked by people who were a bit dubious or skeptical about Therians. They say, okay, well, they think they're not human animals. Is this some ploy for attention? Is this a thing they're saying just to be different or to feel different or distinct somehow? And the answer is no. As far as we can tell, this is right down at the level of how their brain is functioning. This is a difference that's very much rooted in how the brain works. So this is a paper that we've actually published in a journal called Anthozoos. And what we did was we looked at a task, a reaction time task. This is a task that's incredibly difficult to fake. The only real way you can fake it is if you know exactly what you're looking for, you've seen this test before, and you really go out of your way to spam it. So for most people, this is just trying to fake this is next to impossible.
And since we showed up doing this on the fly, people didn't know we were coming to do this.
We kind of invented the measure, we adapted the measure from an existing measure. So in this current form, it had never been seen before.
Right, and then when we did this at the convention, it's not like we had people knowing that we were going to do it. So there was no practice time that was available. Yeah. And
so what we found is that with this reaction time task, you can actually look at the level of milliseconds, and you can see that Therians and furries respond dramatically different when it comes to making decisions about, is this an animal? Is that an animal? Are you a human? Are you not a human? And you can look at patterns of reaction times and see a noticeable difference, right? Hundreds of milliseconds difference in how they're responding, suggesting that for Therians, the concept of me and the concept of non-human animal overlaps a little bit. When you activate one, the other one starts to become active in a way that it doesn't for non-Therian furries. So this really does suggest it's at the level of brain functioning that this is occurring. So no, this isn't just something they've decided to make up. This is right down to the level of how their brain is working, how they feel at a fundamental level. So fun fact, number 14. Fursonas are usually anthropomorphized animals, not animals. So when you ask furries on a 1 to 7 scale, how anthropomorphized is your fursona, we tend to see overwhelmingly that furries fall on the side of mostly or completely anthropomorphized. So this is not to say that there aren't furries whose fursona is just an unremarkable cat that just sits there and does cat things, but a lot of furries, were fans of anthropomorphized animals, and so you tend to see that show through in the kinds of fursonas they create. They're anthropomorphized. Fun fact, number 15. Wolves and foxes are the most popular fursona species, and they have been for quite some time. This is a fairly consistent finding, regardless of how we measure it, how we look at it. Foxes and wolves, or wolves and foxes, I should say, dominate the fursona species fairly consistently. So, it seems like everyone wants to be a wolf. Cats, like Nuka is a cat. Cats are represented among those top 10 or 15 species. Rabbits, not so much. Sorry to that other little bunny character, by the way, is our other little mascot, Kaylee. She's Nuka's little assistant. You see her running around in these slides as well. And it's not just in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I'm looking forward to seeing the results. We're working with a collaborator who is doing some analysis on these categories again for us. I'm looking to see how they've changed over time and see how they line up. Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see.
And this tendency towards wolves and foxes isn't just a Western fandom thing. So this is data taken from the Southeast fandom again. And you find that across Southeast Asia, wolves, once again, regardless of what country you're in, wolves tend to be the most popular species, the most prevalent species, followed closely by foxes in many cases. Dragons are up there, dogs, cats. So regardless of where you go in the world, you tend to see the same handful of species crop up among the most prevalent species chosen for Fursona species, which should make you wonder, well, why is that the case? Why is it always wolves and foxes and dogs and cats and dragons? And this is interesting because there's no one reason, right? Furries have a myriad of reasons for choosing the Fursona species that they do. So there's no one reason why this should be happening, and yet we do find it happening. And part of it, we think, has to do with the media environment that we grow up in, right? When you look at the kinds of stories that our cultures tell around the world, we tend to see wolves and foxes and rabbits and dragons and cats and dogs emerge in the sorts of stories that we tell. And so people from a young age are exposed to these species, and they're the most meaningful to them. Likewise, many people grow up with dogs and cats in the house, right? So dogs and cats may be the animal species that you're the most familiar with, you have the most experience with. And so when it comes time to represent yourself with an animal species, you may turn to the one that you seem to know the best. One question that came up relatively recently, and it was a good question, are you bothered by the influx of new or trendy Fursona species? So this can be the Dutch angel dragons, which rose to prominence quite a bit in the last few years. More recently, we've had protogens come onto the scene. And what we tend to find is that furries seem to be okay with these trends when they arise. When you see Dutch angel dragons or protogens or new species arise, furries are they just roll with it. They go, yeah, go for it. So yeah, these trends don't tend to bother most furries. Fun fact, number 16. These Fursona species have stereotypes associated with them. So some of you may be aware of a stereotype that exists about foxes. Is there any truth to that stereotype? Well, we started off by asking people what stereotypes exist about your Fursona species. And then we had people list off, okay, well, wolves are like this and foxes are like this. Fantastic. So these are the stereotypes that emerge. So what do people think about wolves? And the stereotype that emerged the most was loyalty, right? People say wolves, they're loyal. That was the stereotype. Foxes, they're all about being sly and cunning and slick and clever. Dragons, predominantly about strength and power, raw elemental power. Kind of ashamed to be a cat here because cats are associated with laziness. That was the most defining of the stereotypes associated with cats, much to my my great displeasure. Dogs, again, associated with loyalty. Press F to pay your respects for Seymour in the chat there. Best boy. Rabbits, associated with shyness, being sort of timid in personality. Otters, pretty one-dimensional. Otters, as it turns out, are all about having fun. And so, yep, that's the stereotype there. And so the question is there any truth to these stereotypes, right? So we say wolves are this way and foxes are that way. But what about a person who has a wolf persona? Do they actually describe themselves this way if asked about it? So we did a separate study where we didn't ask about a person's persona at first. We gave them a personality test and we said, do these particular words describe you? And only later on did we ask them about their persona species. And what we found was that some of these stereotypes hold water. People who pick wolves and dogs as their persona species tend to describe themselves as being very loyal. People who pick foxes tend to describe themselves as very sly. Some of the other stereotypes that seem pretty intuitive to you also tend to hold water. So there's a stereotype that bears are big, strong men, and yeah, that's a stereotype that we tend to find some truth to. Bears, again, being associated with being men. There's a stereotype of the cat girl, so to speak, the Japanese cat girl from anime. There's some truth to that. Cats are more likely to be women than men in the fandom. So these stereotypes tend to exist out there. And a lot of people would look at this and say, well, I could have told you those ones. But the reason we look at this data is because sometimes some surprising stereotypes emerge. Stereotypes that, or some patterns exist that go counter to the stereotypes. Not all stereotypes are correct. So for example, the stereotype that foxes are the most promiscuous species in the fandom isn't actually true. In fact, it's the wolves and the dogs who are the most promiscuous. They have the most sex in the fandom, in part because they're the most likely to be in a long-term relationship, right? In committed long-term relationships. And again, despite the idea that foxes are the most likely to be gay in the fandom, it's actually dogs who are the most likely to be gay in the fandom. And in fact, when you ask what is the stereotype, or what truth is there to foxes in the fandom, as it turns out, they're actually among the most shy furries in the fandom, even more so than rabbits. Right? So this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't blindly apply and rely on stereotypes, because as much as you say, well, these things are obvious, some of them aren't. Right? So sometimes the stereotypes are wrong. So fun fact, number 17, speaking about some of these stereotypes, as it turns out, a lot of furries aren't speciest. A lot of furries don't rely on these stereotypes to judge people too much. So what we tend to find with this data, what it essentially shows is if you look at the red and the green bars, as to what extent do furries believe that a person's fursona species tells you something about that person or tells other people something about yourself. And furries kind of agree. Right? Furries do believe that if I know that you're a cat or a dog, or if you know that I'm a dragon, that'll give you some information about my personality, about who I am. Great. So the blue bars are when we ask, well, would that affect the way you hang out with a furry? Would you choose not to hang out with someone just on the basis of their species? And overwhelmingly, furries said, well, no. So furries believe that fursona species tell you something about another person, but they try not to treat each other differently on the basis of those stereotypes. So fun fact number 18. And I should note, by the way, that many of these models come from other parts of the world. They're from all over the world. We have people who are following Furscience all over the place. So it was wonderful to see very different styles of fursuits, to see writing in all kinds of languages, all sent to us. Very, very wonderful to see the creativity of the fandom around the world.
And they knew about it because they followed us on Twitter.
Followed us on Furscience on Twitter and
That's right.
Facebook and all the social medias that I don't have. So fun fact number 18, most furries don't own a fursuit. Fursuits, these full body mascot style costumes as we describe them to the average person, a lot of people associate furries with fursuits, right? Which sometimes has unfortunate effects, because there are certainly fursuits out there which are perhaps better constructed than others, or perhaps have a little more expertise that go into them. But in general, the fursuit is what most people think of when they think of furries. Certainly the media does. When you look at media stories about furries, the media loves to categorize furries as people who wear fursuits, people who wear fursuits, people who put on these fursuits and do things in those fursuits. And we want to tackle that misconception, because it very much is a misconception. When you actually study furries and ask, hey, do you have a fursuit? Only 28% of furries around the world has a fursuit, which means most furries don't have a fursuit. So if you're going to define furries as people who wear fursuits, you're going to be leaving out 72% of the fandom. That would be like describing a sports fan as a person who owns a jersey, or describing a Star Wars fan as a person who owns Stormtrooper armor. We find that about 8% of furries have tried their hand at some form of fursuit construction. And if you want to know why the media focuses so much on the fursuits, I think this picture perfectly summarizes it. I actually went to Google and typed in Star Trek fan to see what would come up. And the first three pictures were these ones right here, people wearing Starfleet uniforms, right? And it's because this is the most visually iconic symbol of the fandom, right? If you were to go to an average furry convention and just sit in on a random panel, you'd see some fursuits, but you'd also see a lot of people just kind of wearing regular clothes, or wearing silly t-shirts, right? They wouldn't look furry to you, right? So when it comes to outsiders looking in on these fandoms, very often they take the most salient or distinct visual element of that fandom and distill the fandom down to that particular element. So furries are often distilled down to that fursuit.
Hey, Nuka, question
Yes.
from Nico Flower. Wondering if we have any data on the fursonas by gender.
Personas by gender. Oh, like so. Whether women are more likely to.
Species.
But yeah.
Yeah, species.
Yeah. So are women more likely to be certain species?
Like cats.
Yeah. We do. So some of those gender stereotypes, or some of those species stereotypes you saw were gendered. So we'd find, for example, women more likely to be associated with cats, men more likely to be associated with bears. Somewhere in the midst of all of the analyses I've run, I know I've looked at particular gender differences. Cats and bears were the two that seemed to jump out the most. For the other ones, if there were differences, they were so small as to be practically insignificant. Right. So yeah, we're talking about like what we would call decimal dust in that regard.
Excellent.
So yeah, good question. Excellent question.
Thank you, Nico Flower.
I should add the one caveat to that is that analysis was done on species where we had enough members of that species in our sample to be able to study it. So if there's a species where we only got 2 members of it, we can't really run an analysis on that because we're essentially basing the entirety of that species on 2 people, which is really not a good thing, not good scientific practice, at least from quantitative research.
And there are some challenges with unequal sample sizes too. It also makes it a bit more difficult.
Yeah. Number 19, fun fact number 19, fursuiters differ just a little bit from non-fursuiting furries. So we've been asked before, is there something different about fursuiters that we can find? And after sort of crunching the numbers and asking a bunch of questions to a bunch of fursuiters and a bunch of non-fursuiting furries, we found some differences do exist. We do find, for example, that the furries who call themselves fursuiters tend to score higher on self-ratings of how furry are you. We don't impose a definition of what that means. We just say on a 1 to 10 scale, how furry would you call yourself? And fursuiters tend to rate themselves higher on that. Now, that doesn't mean that being a fursuiter makes you more of a furry, but what it does mean is that if you're a person who's just kind of dipping your toe into the furry fandom, if you're just getting started in furry, or you're not super into it, you're probably not going to run out and drop $2,000 on a fursuit, right? So typically the people who are going to do that are the people who are much more involved in the furry fandom. They're much more, it's a much bigger part of their life. We tend to find that, proportionally speaking, women are more likely to fursuit than men are. We tend to find that fursuiters tend to lead much more active fantasy lives. So furries tend to have active fantasies to begin with. They tend to be very imaginative. Fursuiters even more so. There's a question of whether or not furry is a fetish. And we tend to find that fursuiters are less likely to describe their interest in furry as having sort of a fetishistic connotation to it. We asked, do you tend to drink more? And fursuiters do drink more. About 50% more alcohol, right? So fursuiters enjoy their alcohol. I should use this as a moment to say to fursuiters, please drink responsibly and please make sure you drink water, right? Don't dehydrate in those suits. As a fursuiter myself, it is very important to hydrate. Alcohol is not hydration.
Don't drink fursuit and drive.
Yeah. We shouldn't fursuit and drive anyway.
Shouldn't do any of that drive.
We also tend to notice in our studies that fursuiters report having more problems socializing in day-to-day life. And indeed, some of the work we've done has suggested that for a lot of furries, the fursuit helps them to develop and work towards social skills. I don't know if you want to speak a bit more to the Sharon, or if you've got some work on that.
Yeah, we have been. So Dr. Fine and Dr. Jabassi and I have been working on some of the autism data. And we've been, actually the study is still open if anybody's interested. I think it's study number 5. But what we've been finding is as we've been going through the qualitative data and isolating people who are autistic or have autism, depending on how you prefer to say that, people who are autistic and wearing fursuits, like what are the benefits or detriments to it? And we don't find that people with who are autistic are more likely to wear fursuits than people who are not autistic. But we do find that there seem to be some pretty good benefits for it. So they describe things like sensory benefits, so the muffling, the weight, the reduction of stress related to having to make eye contact. These things are very positive, and overwhelmingly they are positive. The one negative that we're finding with the research is that sometimes if the inside of the fursuit is scratchy, then that can be unpleasant.
Thank you. Fun fact number 20. Furries have kind of a weird super ability, if you will. If you've heard this talk before, you've definitely heard me mention this one. This is one of my favorite facts about furries. And this is sort of the best way to do it. So if furries look at this slide, furries see 8 very distinct fursuits with 8 very distinct artists, 8 very distinct characters here. Now, to an outsider, to a person who's just sort of casually looking, they see 8 wolf, fox, blue, animal-looking things, right? At a glance, they're all just sort of indistinguishable, similar sort of things. As an analogy to this, I know nothing about cars. To me, a car goes by and it's a box on wheels. My father, however, is very well versed in cars. My father, he knows the make and the model and the year and the engine, and the car goes by and in an instant he can tell you everything about that car, right? It's because he has expertise in that. And so a question that a furry asked us years ago was, is it the case that furries, because they spend so much time looking at non-human animals, are furries bad at recognizing human faces and better at recognizing furry faces or fursuit faces? And that's a testable question. So we ran that test, and we actually published it in a journal called the Journal of Cognition and Culture. So this is a published scientific study. And what we did was we got a bunch of furries and a bunch of non-furry college students who are comparable in terms of demographics and age range to furries, and we gave them a whole bunch of pictures and a memory task. We showed them a bunch of furry faces, a bunch of human faces, and a bunch of fursuit faces over and over and over. And then we showed them a bunch of pictures, some of them new, some of them pictures they'd already seen. And we said, have you seen this picture yet? Have you seen this picture yet? And if you look at the human faces section, furries and non-furries performed pretty much the same. There was no difference between them. So furries are not worse at recognizing human faces. What furries are is freakishly good at recognizing furry faces and fursuit faces. Furries have a bit of a special ability in this regard. All of these years of consuming furry media have led to this really neat ability to recognize these things with an expertise that you see with car aficionados being able to recognize cars, or there are famous studies of farmers being able to recognize their cows in a field at a glance just by the patterns of spots on them. So furries develop that kind of ability, which I thought was kind of neat. Fun fact number 21. The furry fandom is chock full of content creators. There are a lot of independent content creators in this fandom. It is what we call a participatory culture, right? So instead of, say, like the Harry Potter fandom or the Star Wars fandom, where everyone kind of organizes around one main content creator. There are, to be sure, lots of independent content creators, but everyone's sort of organized around one big one in those fandoms. In the furry fandom, there is no one big organizing content creator. It is just thousands of small independent content creators all doing their own thing. And we see that among furries, about 38% of them describe themselves as visual artists, right? So about 38% furries say that they do some kind of content creation. Another 29% are writers, right? They do some kind of creative writing. 17% are musicians. 8% of them are YouTubers, right? So many furries create content, right? Now, not every one of them is a professional. Not every one of them can make a living off of their content. Most can't. But furries are overwhelmingly creative people who do a ton of creative stuff. In fact, when I was analyzing this data, we took furries around the world and we asked them to just list any content creator who's your favorite. It doesn't matter what kind of content they create. And we wound up with a total list of 3,198 different content creators, right? So there is clearly a great many artists out there. These are some of the ones who were the most prevalent, the ones that came up again and again. And you can see here there's a lot of artists, a lot of visual artists, but you also see writers, you also see fursuiters and YouTubers and musicians. Uncle Kage, right, who just, we're doing sort of the lab coat lineup right now here. But Uncle Kage right before us, he is among one of the best known, prevalent, most favorited sort of content creator out there in the fandom. I don't imagine he would necessarily call himself a content creator, but perhaps he does. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But yeah, you can see here just a wide range of different content creators in this fandom of ours. So fun fact number 22, and I have to give special kudos to my favorite picture of the entire bunch here. And it's the one on the right here.
Right.
I believe, if I don't fully know the story, but if I'm understanding what's happening, that's one of those speed traps. And if I'm understanding correctly, to get number 22, this person had to I don't know if they got a friend to do it or what, but they managed to get the number 22 to come up as they were holding the Furscience sign in a fursuit, which is just an amazing amount of dedication. So that is hands down my favorite picture of the bunch. So special kudos to Lucky there, because that was a phenomenal picture.
I also want to point out on the other picture, Bon starred in one of the Furscience productions. So we do things, productions to just work on dissemination to get people's attention. To in some cases, just to get the public to go, what was that I just saw? Come to Furscience and find out. Get the facts. But Bon was our Brady Bunch dad, and starred in our Brady Bunch little video that we did. So hi, Bon.
So furry artists, we shone a spotlight on the fursuiters in the fandom. Now we're shining a spotlight on artists in the fandom. And are there any noticeable, measurable distinctions between artists in the fandom and non-artists in the furry fandom? And we do find some. We find, for example, that there tend to be higher than what you would find in the general population of furries, a higher proportion of women represented among artists in the fandom. And along the same lines, you also find that about 20% of the artists in the furry fandom identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, which is a number that is considerably higher than what you find in the general population and higher than what you find in the fandom, which itself is higher than what you find in the general population. And we'll get to those numbers in a little bit. We also find that furries are remarkably bad at trying to guess the gender of the artist from the art. This was a question that a furry asked us a few years ago. It was kind of an interesting challenge, so we did it. We gathered a sample of different artists in the fandom, and we showed a room full of furries these pictures and had them guess the gender of the artist. And you might as well be rolling a die, right? Furries just absolutely horrendous at trying to guess the gender of the... and we knew the gender of the artist because we asked the artists themselves to indicate their gender. So, as it turns out, the art itself is not a good cue for the artist's gender. We tend to find that among artists in the fandom, they tend to be artists first, and then after the fact, they stumbled into the furry fandom. As is the case with many artists, they developed their interest in art at a fairly young age. And so a lot of the artists said, I was an artist, and maybe I used to doodle animals, but I didn't become a furry till much later in my life, and I just started drawing because I also happened to be an artist by that point. We tend to find that artists in the fandom congregate with one another. So if you are a furry artist in the fandom, about 50% of your friends statistically are also artists in the furry fandom. So artists tend to congregate together. Again, sort of based on questions that we've been asked, hey, how much is this fandom about sex and pornography? We found that about 17.6% of the work produced by artists, or rather 17.6% of artists would say that the majority of their work is erotic in nature. So fun fact number 23, also the suit is adorable. Fun fact number 23, furries spend a lot of money on a lot of things. Furry is a hobby that can very quickly get away from you because there are ample opportunities for creative things that you can spend your money on here. So fursuits, arguably the most apparent one. It's not hard to drop $2,000 or $3,000 on a fursuit. I point at the people that I paid about $1,000 for mine about 8 or 9 years ago, and people kind of laugh and say, "Only $1,000? You got a deal?" Because holy cow, did they go up in price since a decade ago, from what I remember.
Like the housing market.
Yeah, the housing market. But fursuits are not the only thing that you can spend money on here. Among the most popular furry-themed items that furries own, tails. Almost half of furries say they own a tail. About 37% of furries say they own a collar. About a third of furries say they own some kind of furry clothing, some kind of t-shirt or something. About 27% say they own ears, 26% say they own paws. So there's a lot of furry merchandise. Go through any dealer's den at a furry con, and there's a lot of stuff for sale there. In terms of how much furries spend, the blue bars are how much furries say they spent in the past 12 months on each of these things. And the red bars are how much you would spend if you had the money. If you had an infinite amount of money, would you be willing to spend several $100s or several $1,000s on a particular piece of art? And what we find is that on average, furries spends about 3 times as much money, about $150 or $160 a year on average, on digital arts relative to physical art, where they spend about $65 a year. Erotic art tends to be about $75 a year on average. And Patreon, furries tend to be fairly good Patreons, about $50 a year, supporting some kind of small, flourishing independent artists. But the money they spend on art kind of pay. So these 4 bars here end up becoming the 4 left bars on this figure. And you can see that when you zoom out and look at the other items that furries spend money on, furries spend a lot of money, right? $600 a year on average. This is all in American dollars, by the way. Sorry to our European friends there, or the Canadian friends there.
Oh, Canadian. Yeah. Yeah.
But our standard unit for this is everything's converted into American dollars here. On average, furries spend about $600 per year going to conventions, about $300 a year on paraphernalia. So we just said other stuff, tails, collars, other stuff, right? And then we had an other category, which I'm not even sure what's in the other category, stuff that didn't count as paraphernalia. So how furries fill that in is beyond me. I have some idea, but
yeah, other categories and surveys are it's quite a deal to go through them. Open blank spaces can lead to some pretty interesting things when you've got creative furries who are filling them in.
And you also see that furries spend hundreds of dollars, but would be willing to spend, in some cases, upwards of $1,000 a year on these sorts of things. So again, it's a hobby that can very quickly become expensive. And how do furries stack up against other fandoms? It's not really a competition. When you look at, furries as the red bars and anime fans as the blue bars here, you see that furries fairly consistently outspend other fan groups when it comes to pretty much every one of these categories. Right, so furries, hands down, spend a lot more than anime fans on these things. And if you're looking to start a convention and you're trying to figure out what is the general breakdown, conventions probably have better data on this. But just by polling people at a convention, we tended to find that about 70% of our participants were attendees, 20% were sponsors, 10% or so were super sponsors, and about 5% were the hardworking staff who graciously put on these events. Mad props, by the way, to the staff who are currently putting on this event right now. Hats off to them for making this work, because it's a tremendous amount of work, whether it's an in-person convention or an online convention. So,
yeah.
Yes.
Just even with our team, the behind-the-scenes stuff has been going on for over a week with Malicious Beaver, and and we're only one tiny part of this. So yeah, just an amazing job. Thank you, everybody. Your friends.
Furries also spend money on charity. You'll notice here that about 60% of furries say that in the last year they've donated money to some kind of animal-related charity. And 10-15% of furries spend well in excess of $250, $500 a year on some kind of charity. So furries very much get involved in charity. Fun fact number 24. Furries have other hobbies besides just being furry. Believe it or not, furries don't just sit around doing furry things all day. They do other things as well. You can see here when we ask furries to sort of go through and indicate some of their other hobbies, we see here that gamers are among the most popular or the most prevalent single activity that furries engage in. So board gaming, video gaming, very popular. Science fiction, also very popular. Fantasy is also very popular, the fantasy genre. Artists, role players, anime fans. There's a lot of overlap with the anime fandom. And indeed, if you go to anime conventions, you'll always see a handful of fursuits running around there. Go down the list and you can just see there's a lot of stuff furries do here. In the Southeast Asian data that was sent to us, we see they used slightly different categories and got some different responses. Gaming obviously was still number one among all these different groups, so that seems to be fairly universal among furries around the world. But you also see a lot of doodling, sketching, reading manga. Food is apparently a big part. I guess people eat. Who knew? So yeah, food is an important part of furry culture in other places as well. I know that in many of my local furry meetups, we'd go to restaurants very often, or we'd host a potluck. So food can be a part of furry culture as well. When it comes to other media that furries like, You can see here that furries like a wide range of different music genres. Foremost among them are things like rock music, electronica music. These are the sorts of things that you hear playing very often at the dances at furry conventions. When it comes to the sorts of genres of TV that furries like, science fiction, fantasy, comedy, cartoons. Not surprising, these overlap very heavily with what you find in the furry fandom. Not a lot of politics or reality television fans among furries.
Can I just say that we've brought a lot of young researchers with us to our various conventions. We really try and support our students. In fact, the vast majority of our funding goes to supporting our students' education and giving them direct access to learning about research. But I got to tell you that going to a furry rave or dance is just about the most surreal thing that you can do as a non-furry. It's amazing. Just, kudos to all the people who put that stuff together because it's incredible.
The Eurofurence one in particular, I remember very distinctly that the Eurofurence dance last year was hands down the best one I'd ever been to. So,
spectacular. Just spectacular.
Yeah. So number 25, fun fact number 25, furries do a great deal of their interaction online. Furries like the internet, as it turns out. About 80% of furries frequent some kind of furry-themed forum or website with some kind of regularity. That data is a few years old. It's no doubt gone up since then. About 80% of furries use some kind of instant messaging program like Telegram. Again, that's a few years old. That has definitely gone up. Twitter is also very popular among furries, and I'd be remiss if I didn't tell this story. Some of you may be aware of the hashtag #TweetFur movement. This is a wonderful demonstration of what happens when a company who's slightly out of touch tries to control people. So Twitter made an announcement or pointed out that you should not anthropomorphize the Twitter bird with very, very predictable results. This is something called psychological reactance, folks. And as it turns out, when you tell people not to do something, it just makes them want to do it more. So, yeah, I like this picture right here. Admit it, you knew this was going to happen. This is the most basic of psychological principles here. And furries are just as predictably into these sorts of psychological principles as anyone else. When it comes to the most popular websites around the world that furries use, this is in Western samples, I should point out. We tend to find that Fur Affinity is number one among them. It's one of the most common ones used. Telegram, again, this is a few years old. Telegram is almost certainly up there by this point. You also see DeviantArt, E621, Weasel, FList. There's a bunch of these on here. Around the world, many of these same names emerge as well. So on the top here, we have the number one places to share artwork or to find artwork. You see Fur Affinity is in the top 3 for all of these countries: Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand, and Japan. You also see Twitter, very popular among them. You also see DeviantArt and Pixiv. And then when it comes to number one places to communicate with other furries, you see Facebook is very popular, Twitter is very popular, Line, Skype. So depending on the region and what's sort of prevalent there, you see a lot of that program used. Fun fact number 26. Furry conventions are popular and can be found all over the world. Imagine that as we speak, a bunch of North American researchers speaking at a European convention. Imagine that there are furry conventions everywhere. What we do find is that in terms of face-to-face interaction, it may not be quite as prevalent as the online interaction that furries do, but furries definitely get FaceTime with one another. About 1 in 3 furries makes it up to some kind of local gathering or meetup with some kind of regularity, whether this is parades or taking over a bowling alley or going to a restaurant or a house party. About 50% of furries say they make it out to at least one convention a year. And again, depending on your region and your accessibility to a particular convention, this can be easier or tougher. And even though 50% of furries make it to at least one con per year, we do find that about 95% of furries say they've been to at least one furry convention over the course of their life, right? So certainly as time goes on, you spend more time in this fandom, it becomes more and more likely that at some point you'll make it out to some kind of furry convention. And again, we point out that regardless of where you are in the world, you'll typically find a furry convention there. This is a sort of a North American map, which you can see here. Depending on where you are, you can do the same thing with the European map and find that depending on where you are, you can break up the country break up the continent rather based on what conventions tend to be more local to that particular region. Fun fact number 27, and I want to give a shout out here to the Moms of Furries, who have been a wonderful resource for us, an absolutely fantastic group to work with.
I love Moms of Furries.
Yeah, absolutely. They are very instrumental in helping us disseminate our research out there. So furries act differently at conventions than they do in real life. Again, imagine that when you're at a furry convention, people perhaps behave a little bit differently than they would in their day-to-day lives. So what is it that furries do differently at cons that perhaps you don't see in day-to-day life? Well, we tend to see more cuddling and hugging and physical affection. These are all furries giving us these answers, by the way. These are the most common things that furries said are different about furry conventions than day-to-day life. Hugging, physical affection, wearing your furry swag, so wearing your suit, your badges, your arts, your clothing. Sharing in furry culture, whether it's memes or jokes or content, or just getting to talk about the latest whatever shows are out or whatever artist is the next big thing. Making animal noises or sounds or behaving like an animal. You see this a lot more at furry conventions than you'd perhaps see in the workplace or at school. And in general, being more outgoing and socializing. Furries tend to say they come out of their shells a lot more at furry conventions than they do in their day-to-day lives. So fun fact number 28, post-con depression. Some of you may have heard about it. It is totally a thing. This notion of sort of getting back from a convention and feeling the sense of being bummed out and sort of disappointed, going back to the humdrum of day-to-day life. We can actually measure it, and we did so at Anthrocon a few years ago. We gave furries a survey measuring their mood. How do you feel right now? And then a week later, or a few days later, we emailed those same people and asked them, hey, in your day-to-day life, how are things going? And what we found was a noticeable, measurable difference, right? An increase in how bothered you were, how depressed you felt, how everything felt like more of an effort. You felt a little bit less happy, a little bit less motivated. It's like coming back from a vacation, right? You go from a high and you kind of go back to the slump of everyday life. Even if you like your job and you're pretty happy where you are, when you're coming down from such a high, it does feel like a bit of a drop.
I just wanted to add in there that if you're interested in this particular study and you want to support Furry, you could go to the thurstonhowellpublications.com, and this study we published in the Furries Among Us 2 book.
Yep. So fun fact number 29. Most furries are not straight. I know. Kelsey agrees. Right, so when you actually ask furries and you sort of start breaking it down by sexual orientation, you tend to find that only about 20% of furries identify as straight or heterosexual. You see furries are kind of a mixed bag of everything, right? Everything from lesbian and gay furries, bisexual furries tend to be just a little bit more prevalent than straight furries as a category. You tend to see that about 7% of furries identify as asexual. Pansexual, you tend to see about 15 or 16% of furries there. And again, for this question, we give furries an opportunity to write in their own description, and about 5% of furries say none of these really describes them well. So
I wanted to add in here that sometimes you'll see differences in our early data to our later data, and this is one of them, and that was with the introduction of the pansexual being in part of our checkboxes. We began to see what was in the bisexual category moving into the pansexual category, because it was actually a better descriptor of how people actually were. So it's just interesting to see how those numbers have changed. A couple of other ones have changed over 10 years as well, but I always like these ones.
So fun fact number 30. Many furries are in relationships, whether you're straight or gay or whatever you're into. Many furries tend to find significant friendships or relationships within the furry fandom. We find, for example, that around the world, most furries tend to come into the fandom as single. Right? So you see here that around the world, single is the single biggest demographic in the furry fandom, and not just in Southeast Asian samples, but in our own samples as well. We tend to see that a majority of furries identify as single. There are some sex differences there, namely the fact that males in the fandom are more likely to be single, females in the fandom are more likely to be dating or in some kind of long-term committed relationship. But even more interesting than that, I really like this particular data, is the fact that there's a distinction between whether you're straight or not. Right? So if you're straight in the fandom, you're much more likely to be single. Right? If you're gay in the fandom, you're much more likely to be in a relationship, and it's very likely you found your partner through the furry fandom. Because the fandom is such an LGBTQ-friendly place, if you're gay in the fandom, well, you have an abundance of potential partners. They all have the same interest as you do, and rather than looking around and trying to find potential partners in a population, the general population, where the number may be less than 10%, you're finding far more potential partners there. So it's a target-rich environment, if you will. So we tend to find that, yeah, a lot of this boils down in some ways to whether or not you are straight or gay. Fun fact number 31. There are a lot of trans furries in the furry fandom. So the fandom we describe as being this very LGBTQ-friendly place, and you definitely see this when it comes to trans furries in the fandom. Now, this is another one of those topics where we've evolved considerably in the way we've asked this question over the years. Mm-hmm. So we, like a great many scientists before us, made the mistake early on of kind of just saying male, female, other, check a box. Mm-hmm. And furries were quite well within their rights to give us flack for that, and they did. And it took us a few years to kind of work on getting it right, and we're still working on it. We're never perfectly content with it. You can always do better when it comes to the subject. But nowadays, when we ask this question, it's in a much more nuanced way. Typically, we'll ask the question multiple ways. Mm-hmm. Typically, we'll give multiple options. We definitely make a distinction between sex and gender. We don't conflate the two things anymore. And in many cases, we're far more interested in gender than in sex.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that we did was we recognized that we were a bit out of our depth with this. We didn't have any expertise on our team, and so we actively sought out someone who would have that kind of expertise. So Zach Marshall, who's at McGill University, is an expert on trans research and is openly a trans man himself, and it was great to have him come on the team and start working on this particular stuff. So all the things that we're now doing with trans data are going to have the influence of someone with lived experience and expertise on it.
I should point out that this is one of the recurring stories with the Furscience team. Is people ask us to answer a question, and we don't have the first clue about what we're doing because our expertise is in small specific things, but no one else is doing it. So we try our hand at it. We get it wrong, and then someone comes in and gently shows us how to do it, or we contact an expert and say, "Help! We're way in over our heads," and we get it right the third or fourth time typically. So. Science is a messy and iterative process.
Yes, it's evolving. It is evolving. And when we're basically starting in something that is fairly unstudied. Compared to the rest of the topics, right? So, there's not as much, we haven't had as much opportunity to collaborate, I think, as other disciplines would have. But that, I think, is changing. I'm really excited about our collaborations that we're getting.
So all that preamble out of the way for this topic. So we've broken this down. No, my fault. So we've broken this down in several ways. One of the ways we do it is to say, okay, so do you identify as a cis male, as cis female, as trans? What we tend to find is that when you break down the fandom, about 73% of furries identify as a cis male, about 12.6% identify as cis female, and about 13% identify as trans. Some flavor, some variants of trans. That number, by the way, is considerably higher than what you find in the general population. Some of the best data suggests that it may be around 0.6% of the population. So we're talking like 15 or 20 times what you find in the general population when it comes to trans people in the fandom.
Yeah, and this is actually one of those numbers that has changed across our studies. I think in the book, our 2015 book that we published, the number was around 2 or 3%, and so this is really changing. Like this is one of those things that with the demographics of the fandom itself are radically changing. It's very fascinating to see. Yeah.
I'll point out it's probably a few things. It's probably not just the demographic. It probably owes quite a bit to how we've asked it as well. Mm-hmm. I would point out as well. As we refine our question, you'll get changes in the way people answer.
So. Yeah.
Number 32, fun fact number 32, LGBTQ plus furries often get a lot more than just entertainment out of the furry fandom, which is not to say that that straight furries or cisgender furries don't get more than entertainment out of the fandom. But when you look at the comparison and say, to what extent do you get these things out of the fandom, we tend to find that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and asexual furries tend to say they use the fandom for escapism more, to avoid something in their day-to-day life. Very often, being a member of a sexual minority can be very stigmatizing. And so for a lot of furries, it's nice to retreat to a place where this isn't something you have to stress out about. LGBA furries tend to identify more strongly with both their personas and with the furry fandom. They tend to give help and to seek help from the furry fandom more often than straight or cisgender furries do. And they also tend to feel more anxiety. Again, part of that day-to-day life stress. They tend to be more anxious in general as a result of that. With respect to transgender furries specifically, we tend to find that compared to cisgender furries, transgender furries, as you mentioned before, are more likely to be artists. They're also more likely to be therians. We find that transgender furries tend to identify more strongly with their personas than do cisgender furries. They tend to seek help and to give help in the fandom more often. So this seems to suggest that, yeah, for many of these folks, they're getting a lot out of the fandom as well. The fandom isn't just, oh, I like these shows or I like this art, but there's a lot more to the fandom as well. The fandom is the social support network. The fandom is a place of being able to self-express. The fandom is far more than just, I like this stuff. So fun fact number 33. Speaking to this idea that furries might be stigmatized a little bit, furries get picked on a tremendous amount. It's not hard to go online and find evidence of furry stigma if you spend time in message boards or forums online. If you've ever been to 4chan or Reddit, you know that furries are kind of the internet's punching bag. Certainly in the Russian data that was sent to us, we find a lot of evidence from Russian furries that people assume some things about them, just for being a furry. So just because you're a furry, people assume that you're a zoophile. At least 68% of Russian furries say that this is an assumption that people made about them. About 51% said people assume that they had a mental disorder just because, some kind of mental illness because of identifying as a furry. 42% said that people assumed they were gay just because they were furry. 42% said that people assumed they were a sexual deviant just because they were a furry. And 36% said that people assumed they were a corrupter of youth. Right, so take that, what it means, but they said that this is something that people assumed about them. So it seems to be the case, at least in this particular sample, that, yeah, furries experience a considerable amount of stigma. And sure enough, when you ask furries in our Western samples, hey, if people knew you were a furry, would that, how much would you expect them to disapprove? And sure enough, what we find is that compared to anime fans, both online and convention going, and to fantasy sport fans, you tend to find that furries are the highest in terms of people wouldn't think the best things about them. And on the flip side of that, furries are the least likely of the groups to say that they would tell other people about the fandom they belong to, anticipating this sort of social disapproval. Which is why it's not, I love this picture, by the way. This is on the WikiHow page, where it actually has a page on should you come out as a furry, and this is one of the images there, which I think is a fantastic. It's like an IKEA furniture of how to come out as a furry. And again, you can see all sorts of memes about this, right? A furry sort of making light of the fact that what many of them know is they are highly stigmatized by the media they consume, by the sort of world around them. It's not hard to see stories of furries saying that they've been kicked out of their houses by their parents because they found out they were a furry, or they've been rejected for jobs or rejected on dates because someone found out they were a furry. So speaking to this point, compared to a non-furry control sample, furries were far more likely to have experienced significantly more bullying, right? Especially between the ages of 11 and 18, these very formative, important years where furries are answering these big questions about who am I and what kind of a person am I. That's when they're experiencing the significant increase in bullying. It's 62% of furries compared to 40% of non-furries experiencing bullying. And when I say bullying, I'm not just talking about someone making fun of you. I'm talking about getting your ass kicked because you're watching the wrong shows, you're wearing the wrong shirts, you like something that isn't popular. And this is even after statistically controlling for the fact that furries are also more likely to be gay or to be transgender, right? You also get beat up and mocked and made fun of and stigmatized for that. But if you're furry on top of all of that, it just compounds the problem for many furries. And so speaking to this point again, when you look at the Russian data, you find that the majority of furries say that they are often or rarely picked on. So more furries than not say that they have been teased, say they've been threatened. Thankfully, just under half of furries say that they've been physically hurt, right? So more furries have not been physically hurt than have been physically hurt. Property damage, so having things stolen or damaged, being ostracized for being a furry, having lies and rumors spread about you. These are all things that furries are more likely to have experienced than not. So this seems to suggest that, yeah, stigma is a very real thing that furries are dealing with. Speaking to this idea is some new research that we've been working on just in the past year or two, testing a really interesting theory. It's not our own theory. We're taking an existing theory and kind of applying it here to the context of furries. But the theory suggests that when people are bullied or picked on or distanced from the general population, they may turn to or identify more strongly with animals as a result. If humans suck, maybe you'll find solace in animals. And in fact, we've found, writing in all, that the more furries say they've been bullied in their youth, the more likely they are to anthropomorphize animals. And by extension, the more likely they are to see animals as part of their in-group and to even think about themselves in part as animals, typically something like a fursona, for example. So this is some of the first evidence to suggest that perhaps at least some of this anthropomorphization may be in response to, or may have caused, it's kind of hard to infer direction here, but maybe associated with this sort of bullying in youth, right? If the people around you suck, maybe your pet cat, maybe your pet dog becomes your best friend. So, fun fact number 34. The furry fandom shelters, protects, and ultimately saves furries. Right? So we know from research that stigma and bullying is incredibly detrimental to a person. Right? So bullying is one of the most wretched things you can do to a person psychologically and physically. Right? It takes its toll on people. That you're constantly stressed, and it can lead to anxiety and depression. And we know from research that constantly being in a state of stress is taxing on your body's immune system. You become sick more often. It takes its toll on your heart. So by all accounts, by having this increased exposure to bullying in their youth, furries ought to be a lot more, we ought to see signs of this in terms of their psychological and physical well-being. And yet we don't see this in furries. Among furries, we tend to see that their quality of life is pretty comparable to non-furries. And so the question is, what's happening? Why aren't you seeing the detrimental effects of this bullying, of this stigma? And we think it's because of this wonderful fandom of ours, because the fandom looks out for its own, because the fandom is there and provides this social support network. By the way, hats off here to Lemonade Coyote and Dog Bomb, represented here. All right, so the fandom rallies around folks like this. The fandom is there for one another and provides social supports to those in need. And we think that that is an incredible part of building resilience. Right? Despite the stigma that furries often face, they are a resilient group as a result of it. And so speaking to this point, we find that furries say that about 50% of their friends are also furries. Furries surround themselves with other furries in many regards. We tend to find that spending more years in the furry fandom is associated with a lot of positive things. Things like having a greater feeling of efficacy, feeling like you're in control, like you can make things happen in your life, feeling a greater sense of life satisfaction. And this is part of a hypothesis that we've been sort of working on that we call the scaffolding hypothesis, this notion that the furry fandom is functional. You come into the fandom and there are things in your life you're looking for, whether it's companionship, whether it's a significant other, whether it's social skills. The fandom is sort of a place where you can sort of be safe and start exploring and finding outlets for these things, finding a way to develop these things. I don't know if, Sharon, you want to elaborate on that or if I kind of covered it.
You're good.
All right. Well, I know you definitely will want to speak on this next slide here, so take it away, Sharon.
So this is just this is one of the pieces that I'm pretty proud of, the clinical interactions with the anthropomorphic phenomenon. What I was finding is that when we were doing particularly qualitative work, that there were questions that were coming up about the way that people needed support in their lives. Now, when we look at these numbers, we're not seeing these differences, but we know that mental health is a problem for everybody in the non-furry population as much as it is in the furry population. There's no differences in those numbers. So people do need support, but when furries were going to their clinicians, they were not getting the kind of support that they needed. And so this inspired paper to try and explain what the fandom was about in almost like a Coles Notes version of it for clinicians, where they would find it in a peer-reviewed place so that they could give the better kind of support that they needed, an unconditional positive regard to their clients, which is necessary when you're building rapport in a therapeutic relationship with somebody. So this paper was one of those ones that, if somebody is having challenges with their therapist, trying to understand or disclose or to how to have a good rapport and conversation, this is one that can, I think, really facilitate that. At least that's the feedback that we've been getting on it.
So fun fact number 35, community. Perhaps to no surprise based on what we've just said, community is the number one reason why furries say that they are a furry. When we ask, hey, what is furry all about to you? Even more than the arts in it, even more than the love of animals, even more than fursuiting and all these other aspects people associate with being furry, community and the sense of belongingness that it provides is the number one reason that furries indicates to us, right? And indeed, compared to other communities that we studied, anime fans, sport fans, furries, again, are the most likely to say, no, the community is a big part of it, right? I identify with other fans in this fandom. So fun fact number 36, furries are fairly young, demographically speaking. So one of the limitations of our ethics board is that we typically aren't able or less able to study minors than we'd perhaps like.
Right.
One of the good news for some of our additional data sets is we've actually been able to sort of extrapolate or look at where we'd normally miss in our own data set. So you can see here in this particular data, which I believe was from our Russian sample that was sent to us, you see that furries kind of hang around and they're fairly mid to late teens, early 20s. And indeed, if you look at the shape of that graph, and then you cut to our graph is basically where that graph ends off at the age of 18.
Yeah.
Right? So what we tend to find, and we've said for years, is that furries tend to be overwhelmingly young. We tend to see a lot of late teens, early 20s, with a bit of trail off, which is not to say, of course, that there are not furries well into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. As a furry who is pushing closer and closer to the average age of a self-described greymuzzle, I am very aware of the fact that there are furries well into their 30s and 40s. Right, so let's not pretend that they don't exist as well. Fun fact number 37: ageism is kind of a thing. The idea that we may treat people differently in this fandom because of their age is something demonstrable, and this figure kind of says it all, and it kind of works in both directions. So what this figure is essentially saying, if you look at the blue bar is furries who are 24 years old or younger, and you ask them, how likely would you be to hang out with a hypothetical 18-year-old furry, or 25-year-old furry, or 35-year-old furry, or 55-year-old furry? You see the blue bar kind of goes up and then it nosedives, right? So a lot of 24 and under furries are okay to hang out with younger furries, but don't like to hang out with older furries. The same also happens in reverse. When you ask a lot of furries who are 35 and older, so in their 40s and their 50s, they're happy to hang out with 25 and 35 and 55-year-old furries, a lot less hesitant to hang out with 18-year-old furries. And we think that part of this has to do just with generational divides. So if you're a 55-year-old or if you're a 45-year-old, you're at a different part of your life right now than an 18-year-old is.
I'm talking about my mortgage rate.
Yeah, and a 45-year-old is talking about how many years they have left on their mortgage, and they're talking about, their job and how many years they got till retirement. And an 18-year-old is talking about moving out of their parents' house and their first girlfriend, right? So there's not just in terms of where they are in their life, but also in terms of the media that you're consuming, right? So if you're 45 or 55 years old, you were consuming content from artists that have been around before some of the furries in this fandom were even born, right? So just in terms of common parlance, there's a lot less you have in common. You grew up with very different artists. The fandom was a very different place when you first got there. So as a result, you have a little bit less in common. This doesn't mean you can't bridge those divides. And it's wonderful how you can have, at a convention space, 25-year-olds sitting at a table next to 50 and 60-year-olds.
70 and 80-year-olds.
Yeah, and they're all sharing that same experience. But
shout out to Grandma Kage, by the way. Sorry. Love you.
But it does explain why that there's a little bit of a rift that needs to be overcome there in terms of these generational divides that are there. Fun fact number 38, we have another lovely lab coat there. I can appreciate the aesthetic there. The furry fandom is not really getting older, which is kind of a weird thing to say. But in aggregate, the furry fandom is not getting older. And this figure is probably my favorite figure of all the figures we have, because it shows what I mean so beautifully. So the yellow bar is the Brony fandom, the My Little Pony fandom, which we studied over the course of 7 years. And what you see over the course of 7 years is about a 5 or so year increase in the average age of bronies. So what was happening is bronies got into the show fairly early on, and they stuck with the show as the show went along. They aged with the show. Typically by season 3 or season 4 of the show, if you weren't on the bandwagon, you weren't ever going to get on it, right? You kind of missed that train. So you see that the fandom is kind of the same group of people aging over time. Now look at the furry fandom. In that same 7-year period, you see about a 1-year difference in the average age of a furry. So what's going on here, right? What you see happening is a couple of different things. Part of it may be that older furries are simply leaving the fandom. Older furries are slowly drifting away from the fandom. They're not making it out to as many events. They're not as active anymore in events, which makes them harder to study. So either they are officially leaving the fandom or just less involved in the fandom. Another thing that's happening, and we think this is probably more likely, and people who run events can probably confirm this for us, if you look at the demographic breakdown of those who are involved in the fandom, there's just a swath of young people coming in. If you look at that extended graph that goes before the age of 18, you see that there's a whole lineup of young furries chomping at the bit coming into the fandom, which keeps the age rather low. As there's new series, as you have shows like Zootopia, or more recently DNA, I think is going to be a show that gets a lot of new folks into the fandom. You have this constant influx of younger folks keeping the fandom a relatively young place. And so I think this is what we mean when we say the fandom is sort of, it doesn't get much older as an aggregate group, right? There's this new influx of young blood, which I think keeps it vibrant and makes it kind of an exciting place to be. It doesn't get stagnant. And certainly furries who've been around for a lot longer than I have can attest to the fact that the fandom is a very dynamic place. It doesn't just sort of stay stagnant over the years. There's constantly new stuff coming into it that keeps it exciting. Fun fact number 39. Furries have all sorts of religious backgrounds. Furries come from all walks of life. We see here that in a Western sample, when we asked furries about their religious orientation, we see a good mix of about a quarter Christian, about 1/3 are atheist or agnostic, about 11% are pagan or Wiccan. You see some Buddhism, some Judaism, some Satanism, some deism. About 26% are, when you say other, furries just go to town on it.
Yeah, that's why I was giggling. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's a big mix. And so what we find when we look at other regions of the world, a lot of the time that mix-up of the religion background is a product of where you are. So if we go and we do a survey in Dallas, Texas, we're typically going to find more Christian furries than if we did a study up in Canada, up at Vernal Equinox, for example. So what you see here, for example, if you look in Malaysia, right, it's a breakdown between Islamic furries and non-religious furries. If you see in Taiwan, very non-religious, very secular. If you look to Thailand, there's a lot of Buddhist furries. If you go to Japan, a lot of furries aren't comfortable expressing their religious beliefs, or they say Buddhism there. So whatever's sort of prevalent in that region, you tend to see furries sort of bridging that religious gap. And I guess religion is not incompatible with furry as a hobby, you might say. Fun fact, number 40. Most furries tend to lean towards the liberal side of the spectrum, right? And we've had our knuckles wrapped in the past for the way we ask this question in a very Western-centric way. simply asking, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Right?
By the way, we don't even have Democrats and Republicans where we are.
Yeah.
So
so we tried to, in recent years, we've tried to be a lot more nuanced with this. And so you can see here, we try to give a lot of different labels. For those in Europe, Democrats tend to be the more liberal party in the States, as liberal as you can get in the States. And Republican tends to be the more conservative sort of party. And what you tend to see here is furries are much more likely to identify in a liberal fashion than in a more conservative fashion. If you go to sort of more extreme ends of the spectrum, a lot of concern, a lot of alarm was raised about the propagation of Nazi furs or race supremacists or white nationalists in the furry fandom. And I'm happy to say that you don't see a lot of those in the fandom. Certainly when they are around, they do make waves, and we do hear about them, but it seems to be a disproportionately small group. This is a sample of about 300 furries here, and we didn't get a single one. So it's not to say they aren't out there, but rather that it tends to be a very small minority making a lot of noise, disproportionate to how big they are as a group.
And those data were from the South U.S.
Yeah, this is from the southern U.S. Yeah. In terms of a scale going from social conservatism on the left to social liberalism on the left to social conservatism on the right, we tend to see furries are quite liberal leaning when it comes to social issues, right? So things like gay marriage and such. Surprise, surprise, a group that's particularly LGBTQ is very progressive when it comes to these sorts of issues like gay marriage and trans rights. When it comes to economic issues, being more economically liberal or economically conservative, we tend to see furries are split right down the middle. Right? So furries are much more divided on things like socialized medicine, things like free market. Furries deliberate much more extensively on these issues rather than on social issues. In terms of issues of whether it should be no state power versus complete state power, furries fairly moderate on that. Most furries tend to be right down the middle on that. In terms of free speech versus limited speech, this has been sort of a hot button issue in recent years, with concerns about things like cancel culture, with concerns about, are furries all for banning problematic talk? You see that furries tend to lean towards free speech, right? Unlimited free speech or close to unlimited free speech. There aren't a lot of furries who are calling for significantly limiting free speech. So fun fact number 41, furry drama is totally a thing. And so you've heard people talk about drama in the furry fandom. We'll talk about it a little bit here. We've actually recently published a paper, or a chapter rather, in the Furries Among Us 3 by Thurston Howell. So I believe that just came out like a week or two ago. Yeah,
thurstonhowellpublishing.com is where you can go to support your furries. We don't get paid for doing that work, by the way. We just send it off to them.
Yeah. But it's a whole chapter on furry drama, but the sneak peek of it is that you can, in fact, define drama. We've tried to, at least, based on hundreds of people trying to define drama. We've extracted the common elements, and we find sort of three things that make drama drama. Namely, there's some kind of conflict between people. It usually gets blown out of proportion, and it tends to happen in a public sphere. It tends to happen online. And it's easy to trivialize drama. It's easy to say this is a thing that we can laugh about, that we shouldn't take seriously. But when you ask furries why they leave the fandom, drama is the second biggest reason for furries choosing to leave the fandom, or if they have left the fandom, why they said they left the fandom. So it's worth taking these things seriously. It's worth not just trivializing it or say, haha, drama is just a thing you have to put up with. Maybe take it seriously, and maybe we should take steps towards things like, hey, when you see it happening, maybe don't shine a spotlight on it. Maybe don't feel like you need to jump in and amplify it unnecessarily when you don't have to. In terms of elitism and gatekeeping in the furry fandom, this is a paper that it's about to come out in the Journal of Fandom Studies, looking at elitism in the furry fandom. And what we tend to find is that you can measure elitism and break it up into a tendency to see yourself as better than other people and a tendency to look down on other people. And what you tend to find is that people who are here for community, for the sense of fandom, they're far less likely to be associated with elitism than people who are less involved in the fandom. If you're just here for the art and you don't get involved in the community, that makes a person a little bit more likely to have these more elitist ideas. And this elitism, in turn, is associated with gatekeeping behavior, with this idea that you don't belong in this fandom, get out of my fandom, or we don't want you here. Fun fact number 42, again, another fantastic lab coat and some big-ass ears, which I love. Furries assume that problem behavior is more common than it actually is. This is a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, if you want to get into the psycho jargon. But the idea is that when you ask furries how common are certain behaviors in the fandom, furries will often say, well, I don't do this stuff, but I know most furries are doing it. And when you actually measure this in furries, most furries aren't doing this stuff or aren't doing it to the same extent that furries think they are. So when you ask about drinking or smoking or partying or drug use, furries say, oh, most furries or a lot of furries are doing it, but I'm not. But when you actually ask furries, are you doing these things, you tend to see that rates are actually fairly low for these things. So a lot of these problem behaviors, a lot of the kinds of behaviors that we worry about as a fandom are often more blown out of proportion than we think we are. We hear about a few sensationalist examples and go, oh my gosh, this is everywhere in the fandom. But when you actually go on a case-by-case basis and you talk to furries, most furries aren't doing this stuff. It's often more blown out of proportion than it actually seems.
And we have good reason to believe that social desirability effects are not at play here.
Fun fact, number 43. Furries are not deviants, in a sense. So the question, are furries deviants? Well, statistically, yes. If you're using the term deviant to mean people who are statistically rare, then it is true to say that furries are unusual. Most people in the world are not furries. But if you're asking, are furries pathological? Are furries people who need to be diagnosed? Are furries people who have some kind of problem that needs to be fixed or worried about? The answer is no. There's no evidence we have that suggests that furries are more aggressive than anyone else, that furries struggle in their day-to-day lives more than anyone else, that furries have mental illness more than anyone else. But the only thing we can find in the furry fandom that's higher than the general population would be people on the autism spectrum, right? And even then, there are all sorts of questions about that as more and more research comes in on autism. And much of what we suspect is happening here is that one of the defining features of autism is a strong, narrow interest in a particular topic, right? What is a fan if not a person with a strong, particular interest in a specific topic?
Oh, right. And if I can just interject here,
Go ahead.
we've got something really great coming up on the website. So Dr. Fine, who specializes in autism and just published a book on autism, has been working on furries and autism, and we've got a really good section that we're going to be launching really soon on the website. So come back to furscience.com to check for that.
And we also think that, related to that idea I was saying, we find a higher rate of autism in the furry fandom. We also find a higher rate of autism in the anime fandom and in the brony fandom and pretty much every fandom we've studied. So this also leads us to believe that fandoms in general tend to be places where if you have a strong, passionate interest in something, like a lot of autistic people do, this is a place where you fit in quite well. So there's a stereotype of furries as being people who are maladaptive, people who don't cope very well with life, people who are living in their parents' basements. The kernel of truth in this, you can see here that for furries under the age of 24, most of them are living with their parents. The kernel of truth in this is definitely contextualized with the caveats that most furries under 24 are earning less than $20,000 a year, which makes it remarkably difficult. This is, again, American dollars. It makes it remarkably difficult to move out, especially in the kind of economic climate we've had in the past decade or so. What we do tend to find is in general, younger people are finding it harder and harder to become financially independent and move out. But once furries are able to do so, they do tend to move out just like anyone else. And there are some major qualifications on this as well, which we'll get to in a second. We also tend to see that furries as a group tend to be fairly middle class, perhaps on the slightly lower end of middle class. This is data taken both from our North American sample and the sample we did at Eurofurence last year. So when you combine them together, you see that furries tend to be fairly middle class. Number 44, furries, absolutely nerds. Furries as a group tends to be more educated than not. We tend to find that a lot of furries are currently involved in or have been to university, which may also explain why a lot of furries who are 22, 23 years old are still living at home, because they're still going to school. And among those furries who've gone to school, they tend to do pretty well. The average furry tends to earn grades in the mid to high B range. So furries tend to like school and tend to be fairly involved in school. So this is the part of the talk where we get into sex and fetishes and all of that good stuff. So if this is a topic that sort of squicks you, or a topic that makes you kind of uncomfortable, this is your opportunity to sort of, take off now. We've covered everything except that, so that's going to be the last section. We're going to be mature about it. We're going to, you're not going to see a lot of graphic images here, but I would just give that heads up to folks just in case they want to avoid that particular content. So, fun fact number 45, furry is a fandom for most furries, and it's a fetish for some furries, right? So these things are not mutually exclusive. It's not that you can be one but not the other. In the past, I think I may have been a little more sex negative when I was first getting into the research. I think I was still making this distinction. Now we've definitely evolved on this idea that, we're sex positive. There's nothing wrong with having fetishes, and certainly furry being a fetish for some does not detract from being a fandom or vice versa. What we do say, however, is that defining furry as just a fetish is probably incorrect when you look at the data, right? So when we ask furries, to what extent do you consider furry to be a fetish for yourself? When you look at the red bars, the majority of furries say not really, or they tend to be on the left side of that figure. They say it's not really a fetish for me. I wouldn't call it a fetish. Certainly for about 15 to 20% of furries, they would say, yeah, it's a fetish, and my interest is predominantly a fetish. But for a lot of furries, they say maybe a little bit or not really. Right? So to qualify it solely as a fetish would be a mischaracterization. Fun fact number 46, furries look at pornography. Again, quelle surprise. In fact, the majority of the world looks at pornography. Furries are no different in this regard, although compared to other fandoms, furries do look at a fair bit of pornography. Furries are fairly positive when it comes to the topic of pornography. Again, porn exists in the fandom. We find that about 96% of men in the fandom look at furry pornography. About 17% of them say that the only pornography they look at is furry pornography. And about 78% of women in the fandom say they look at furry porn. And again, 2.2% say the only porn they look at is furry pornography. The men in the fandom tend to be a bit more positive towards porn in the fandom. Women in the fandom tend to be a bit more ambivalent towards the subject. This is some data that we did based on a recent replication of some existing research. In this research, furries were characterized by the author as being people who, among other things, had a sexual attraction towards animals. Right, and this was based on what I think is a fairly unfair reading of the data. So we recollected some data, and we're working on publishing this right now. But I want to show you some of the data to illustrate how it was misconstrued and why it's so important to have furry eyes on this, sort of helping keep the record straight. So this is, to what extent are you attracted to anthropomorphic animal characters? Clearly, furries are attracted to anthropomorphized animal characters, right? So furries are, if it's got ears and a tail, furries think that's really adorable, and also, yeah, it's kind of attractive. Are you attracted to the idea of being an anthropomorphic animal character? Sure. Right. So if this is something that's interesting to you, if you like the furry world, then yes, you infuse your interest with some sexuality in the same way that if you like science fiction stories, what's more fun than being an attractive-looking person having sex in a science fiction world? This right here, though, was the data that was misconstrued horribly. This is the data that was used to suggest that furries were attracted to real animals. Right. So this is a 1 to 10 scale. And you can see here, there's a very clear trend in this data, right? The vast majority of furries are on the left side of the figure saying, no, I'm not really attracted to I'm not really attracted to animals. I'm attracted to anthropomorphized animal characters, not really real animals, though. On the right side of the figure, you see a small percentage of folks there who are. But what this author did was they took anyone who wasn't a 1. They took the 40% of people who weren't a 1 and said, well, at least 40% of furries are into animals, right? Which I think is a gross misrepresentation of what this figure is actually saying, right? The average person who hears that isn't going to picture this figure. Right? That's not the figure that they're picturing in their head. So this is what we mean when we try to set the record straight, when we try to get involved and collaborate with people who are doing this kind of research, even though we disagree with some of the conclusions they've reached, because we're trying to reinterpret this and help set the record straight, presents a more honest representation of the data. Fun fact number 47, furries like porn, obviously based on the previous data we've shown, but that's not their primary reason for being here, right? So when you ask furries, hey, when you look at art, do you just look for the pornographic stuff, or do you just like art in general, or do you avoid the pornographic stuff and just look at the non-pornographic stuff? And what you see is that furries are kind of down the middle. There's definitely a preference for pornographic arts, but in general, furries just like art in general. They like furry arts. If it's erotic, fantastic. If it's not, they still just like it. And so this idea that if anyone says, oh, no furries are sexual, or all furries are sexual, has sexualized the fandom, then that's a gross oversimplification of what the data suggests. And again, we're coming at this from a sex positive. There's nothing wrong with having a furry fetish. There's nothing wrong with being attracted to this, but it's not an accurate characterization to say the fandom is all about the fetish, right? When we ask, hey, is porn the reason why you're a furry? Only about 5 to 10% of furries overwhelmingly agree with the sentiments, right? Many furries say, yeah, porn might have been something that helped me get through the door, or something that I certainly like, but that's not the defining feature of my interest. That's not what I'm here for. And certainly we see this around the world. Again, in our Southeast Asian data we see art and community are among the #1 reasons that furries around the world are furries. Again, Japan is sort of that odd one out. Japan suggests that fetishes very much are a part of the fandom there. So perhaps it would be correct to say that fetishes are a fairly significant part of being a furry in a place like Japan, to a much greater extent than what you would find in some of these other locations. And sort of driving this nail home, when we ran what's called the structural equation model, looking at some of this data, looking at all the different factors, sexual and non-sexual, that contribute to the question, do you call yourself a furry? We tend to find that it's the non-sexual stuff that predicts, do you call yourself a furry? The sexual stuff really doesn't predict the extent to which a person calls himself a furry. Again, the sex is definitely there for many furries, but that's not what makes a furry a furry. I guess that's the point we're making.
Nuka, point out the 0.81 and the 0.02 and what those specifically mean there, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, so when you see at the very bottom, non-sex latent, that's to what extent is non-sexual stuff predicting fan identity, and that's 0.81. 1 is the highest you can get on this. These are standardized. So 1 is the highest you can get, and that is 0.81. That is a very strong relationship. The 0.02 above that, sex latent is sexual stuff predicting fan identity. That is 0.02. So one of those numbers is bigger than the other.
Yeah.
Class in structural equation modeling.
The neat thing about structural equation modeling, though, is it estimates everything at the same time, and so it gives you a really good idea of what's happening in a situation. So it takes into account all these variables at once. Yeah. This is really important.
Fun fact number 48. We're almost through here. Furries, very open and positive about sexuality. We've mentioned here that we're coming into this from a very sex-positive approach these days. Furries certainly are very sex-positive as a group, which can sometimes be to a fault. It can sometimes make it very difficult to compare furries to other groups, because if you wanted to measure, say, fetishes and the prevalence of fetishes in the furry fandom to fetishes in other fan groups, well, furries have admitted to us that they'd be much more open discussing their fetishes here than, say, bronies would or anime fans would, right? So if we find higher rates of fetishes in the furry fandom than, say, in the brony fandom or the anime fandom, is it because these things are more prevalent in the furry fandom, or is it because furries are more open about talking about them? So it can make it very difficult to compare these things one-to-one, which is one of the reasons why we haven't really done that particular comparison.
And that's what I meant by the social desirability effects. Not, this is the reason that we don't think social desirability is coming into play with some of those other graphs.
Because furries are pretty open about telling us about what they're into. Speaking to that idea, when we ask furries, list off your fetishes, this is what we tended to get. Right? So these are the prevalence of different fetishes in the furry fandom. Furries are very open in talking about these things with us. You can see here a wide range of different fetishes. Some of the ones worth pointing out because they are issues that people talk about and discuss quite a bit. BDSM, 39.2% of the fandom say they're into some sort of BDSM. Power play, kind of related to BDSM there, 16%. We see ABDL, baby fur and cub fur, listed as a fetish by furries there, 8.1%. Zoophilia was just at the bottom of this list here. It didn't make the top 15, but zoophilia was 6.89%. That's a topic that a lot of furries talk about, and so that's sort of the data. If you want to discuss prevalence rates about it, that's the prevalence for you right there. And go ahead.
I just really wanted to make a distinction there.
Go ahead.
That when we have these, they're often a list, and then people check them off, and so how people are defining them is not.
In this case, it was open-ended. In this case, it was right in a box.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah. Well, anyway, there's a difference between zoophilia and
bestiality.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just. Yeah.
Yeah. 49. If you're interested in all of this data, there's a place where you can go to learn more about it. And we've mentioned it already. So this is all of our social media, at Furscience on Twitter, Furscience on YouTube, and on Facebook. All of this data is available. Most of this data is available on there. We're slowly uploading it all onto there. All of our chapters, all of our publications are available there. You can get in touch with us there. We'll leave this slide up during the Q&A if there's still time for that. But before we get to that, number 50, I just wanted to say my favorite fact of all of these, and that's that furry audiences are hands down the best audiences to give talks to. Thank you very much, for taking 2 hours out of your evening to listen to us talking stats at your face. It's always remarkable how self-driven furries are to this stuff. So thank you very much. We're totally open to Q&A if we've got time. I don't know. I think we're the last act of the night, I think. So
I think so. Yeah. So we do have some questions here. That's the one I was hoping that you would leave it on. So we've got questions from Ziggy Wolf today. What is the difference between bi and pan?
Good question. So as a person who identified as bisexual at one point and now identifies as pansexual, I can take a crack at answering this. So the distinction is kind of a tricky one because as a person who was bisexual for years, I took bisexual to mean I don't care. I'm okay with. I don't really care what the person's gender is. I'm interested in anyone. At some point along the way, a bit of a distinction was made, and pansexuality started to become more used in common parlance. And pansexuality sort of come to mean a person who is interested in someone regardless of gender. Bisexuality, because of the elements of bi in there, it suggests sort of one or the other, right? So I'm interested in men or women, but it kind of excludes non-binary people by definition.
It has a cis-normative feel to it.
Yeah. So a lot of people have said that pansexuality may be the better term, maybe the term that a lot of people who may have called themselves bisexual. If you say basically I don't care, you probably fall more into the pansexuality category.
Yeah, again, more inclusive.
Yeah, growing up as bisexual, I assumed that's what that meant, but the definition sort of evolved over time. I think pansexuality is what a lot of people would probably call themselves. And again, this is a debate. We don't hold a monopoly on this definition. Some people will debate back and forth on what these terms mean or whether this is a distinction that's even there. But yeah, that's sort of how the word pan tends to be used, as everyone inclusive.
Great. Okay, so I hope I get this right. Fatukio today asked, among the 72% of furries who don't have a fursuit, do you have data about those who would get a fursuit if they could?
We do, although the data's not, the way we asked that question originally wasn't great. And it's one of those questions where we have to revisit it. Now that we have some hindsight, we can sort of see the way we've asked it. We would definitely ask it a little bit differently. To the best of my knowledge, the majority of furries would like a fursuit, right? Most people would like a Ferrari. The question is it something that would you work towards it? Would you, if you had the money available, would that be your first priority? So most furries, not all furries, would like a fursuit. I think if I remember right, it's 10 to 15% say they have absolutely no interest in one. The question is, do you just sort of want one in theory? Or is it something like, do you plan to get one in the next year? And that's a distinction that we didn't make well enough, I think, originally. So in the future, don't be surprised to see that question. or we make more of a nuance of, hey, would you want one someday in theory? Are you 5 years away from getting one? Are you making plans to getting one? Are you saving to get one? Those sorts of questions. So, excellent question.
Yeah. Conwolf asks, our fursuiters less likely to also be visual artists?
Ooh, our fursuit. So our fursuiters less likely to be visual artists.
Yeah.
I never thought to check for that one before.
Yeah, I'm sure we have the data to be able to run that, though.
Yeah, we have the data to run it. I'll make a note here.
Yeah.
Expect at some point that analysis, the results of that will wind up on our website. Or if you want to email us and get the answer directly, just email us and I will get you the answer. That's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
Yeah, make a note of it right now.
Our fursuiters less likely to also be visual artists. Okay, good. Luna, question to fact 13 and 14. Where do plantigrade and digigrade fursonas fall on the completely feral, completely anthropomorphized scale?
Great question. We have not asked that. I'm not sure. I think individual furries would put that in different places. That's one of those questions where it seems so obvious. I'm surprised we haven't asked it before.
I got a list of them here for us. So
that will at some point make its way on. We've asked it, or we've wanted to ask it a couple times, and for whatever reason, it's never made the cut. We're always cutting questions and trying to figure out how to get the more bang for our buck out of our surveys. And that one, I think, has not made the cut a couple times, but it's on we got to get it on there at some point. So
yeah, well, the survey this time is I think we said estimated 60 minutes to take. So so that's kind of where that happens sometimes. This is an interesting question. Furries who are also Therians tend to have less anthropomorphized fursona? So that's from Fenmar, who asked this question. I'm actually not sure about that one. Do they tend to have less anthropomorphized fursonas? Do you?
Do Therians have less anthropomorphized fursonas?
Yeah, like more feral fursonas?
Yes, I believe I remember asking that or running that analysis. I don't have the data on hand. I have run that analysis, and yes, that is the case. I can't tell you off the top of my head how big that distinction is, but it is there, and it is statistically significant.
Mm-hmm. I just to add a little bit to that, I found that some of the data related to when Therians know that they are Therian versus when furries identify as furries, I found that those distinctions were really fascinating. So when we've asked people with retrospect, when did you know that you were furry? The answers in the early teens, if I'm remembering this correctly, Nuka.
Yeah, Therian tends to be a little bit earlier than furry.
Yeah, and the Therians were like 5 or 6 years old.
Yeah,
and so
I think furries were about 13, 14.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting distinction as well. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking to continue on. By the way, if you are Therian, if you do identify as Therian, it's always been really interesting to me to hear people come up to us after our research talks when we have them in person and say, I didn't know that there was a name for what I felt. Like there's an entire, there's an entire community around it.
Didn't know there was a name for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's always really interesting to, I don't know, meaningful to me anyway when that happens. We do have a study for Therians that is available on our website. So if you identify as an animal and you want to tell us about those experiences, then that would be great. What we have found, I think, with the therianthropy angle is that really, unfortunately, therianthropy is pathologized in a lot of the literature, and for example, like the psychiatric literature. And I think ultimately the direction of our research is going to show there are a lot of people who are living very well lives, but they're living good lives, but they are fearful because people don't understand this part of who they are. So I think that's that kind of research I think is going to lead us in different directions. Paywolf asks, is there furries without a fursona? The answer is yeah. Yeah,
about 5%. About 5% of furries say they have not had a fursona. They've never had a fursona.
Floofy Fred asks,
That's a great name.
Isn't it? Any data about jobs or careers that furries pursue?
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to back up one step. Years ago, If you spent time on the website, this is a long thread. I did my best in a rush state to organize the data on like 3,000 distinct Fursona species. And I've never heard the end of it because in trying to organize this, it was a mess, right? So I made the mistake of putting a possum under general rodents, right? Knowing full well a possum is not a rodent, but I thought it's a small fuzzy mammal, close enough, right? Furries chewed my head off for that. The point is, anytime you have an open-ended question, you try to categorize it, it is a giant undertaking. It is dozens, hundreds of hours to organize that. And no matter how you organize it, someone takes issue with how you've categorized it, right? So either you make it so specific that it's too useless, like it's too specific to be useless, or you make it so broad that it's too useless. And so when it comes to the job thing, that's what happened to us. We've asked before in an open-ended question, hey, 5,000 furries, what kind of job are you in or going into? And it was there's just so much to go through. There wasn't really an easy way to parse that and organize that in a way that wasn't just a list that was 1,000 different careers long. So what we need to do, and this is the thing we thought about for a few years, is people who are smarter than us, or people who work in these fields, have certainly done it, right? Like on the census, they have ways of sort of blocking and organizing career choices, or universities have ways of blocking and organizing the different academic fields. So trying to get our hands on some of those questions and see, is there a way to streamline the process so that I don't have to look at a list of 5,000 different careers and say, okay, how many boxes do I need, and what assumptions do I need to make, and how many people am I going to piss off by calling them a visual artist when they're actually a graphics designer or something like that. So as a general, to give you a bit of an answer, as a general trend, furries tend towards the natural sciences and the social sciences. They tend to move towards the visual arts, the graphic arts and the visual arts.
Science and IT too, right?
Yeah, IT, that's what I was thinking of, and IT as well. Yeah, computer and tech as well. So those tend to be the big fields that a lot of furries tend to, because furries as a group tend to be nerds, tend to be geeks. We're kind of raised on this internet culture, and so the kinds of fields that geeks go into are very appealing to a lot of furries.
Okay, so we are at 7:20, so we have to wrap things up here. Just a couple of housekeeping issues, if we're okay with it. I just wanted to say that if you are in Germany specifically, and shout out to all the people that are in Berlin right now, if you weren't able to complete our study last year, we still have that one up and running. So that one has been a bit put on hold by COVID. It's an international study that we're doing, number 8, and it's the 3 fandom study. So we're looking at anime fans, furries, of course, and sport fans. And we have that study available in English, but also in German. So if you are looking to be part of that, and you didn't get a chance to answer our study last year when we were actually on the ground in Berlin, that one's still available. But if you did a survey with us last year when we were at Eurofurence, then that's the same study, so you don't need to worry about that. But we did have it translated, so it is available in German. And don't forget that study number 9 is going to be open shortly, as soon as we get last little.
We're hoping for end of next week.
Yeah, as soon as the ethics board gives us our final check mark on that. So watch for that coming. We'll also announce it. Please do sign up for our YouTube and share our YouTube channel at Furscience. We are working on bringing a different kind of dissemination to our YouTube channel. So Elizabeth Dr. Fine is going to be talking a bit about her autism work, the new paper that Courtney is lead author on, the Furries Among Us chapters. We're looking to do little brief segments on the research, just to make it a bit more accessible. So please do sign up for that, and tell your friends and family to support our research by signing up for stuff. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. We're still there, so please do that. And then the last thing that I wanted to do was to give a really big, heartfelt thank you to the team on Eurofurence. I'm sorry if I get these names a bit bit mixed up, but Cosmilk, Sniffer, Pepper Coyote, Teo, Ardapple, Fluffy, Sanbo, Meerkat, Jumpy Squirrel, Zero, Karen Thran, Canamau, Foxamore, and especially to Cheetah Spotty Cat and to Big Blue Fox, who's been working with us all week. Just like a big thank you very much for everything that you've done. We really, really appreciate the opportunity to get what we're doing out there.
We're very sad we couldn't be there this year. Trust us.
Yeah.
Next year.
And so I hear that the Germans say that the buffet is just like it's a reasonable buffet, but for us, that buffet at the Astral is like the best buffet we've ever had, best breakfast ever. So if you ever come to Canada or the United States, please be aware that you're going to be disappointed by buffet breakfast.
We're sorry.
We're very sorry. We're Canadian. We're sorry. Okay, I think that's it. I'm ready to sign off. You?
Yep, we're all good. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Stay safe.
Be safe. Stay well. Use your
Wear a
mask. Social distance.